He ordered a simple cold wife. The wild frontier woman set his entire ranch on fire. The letter said she was of quiet disposition and capable of managing a household. That's what it said. I read it twice because I'm the kind of man who reads things twice before he acts. 7 words. Quiet disposition. And I thought, good, that's what I need. Quiet. I'd had enough of the other kind. My first wife, Martha, God rest her, was not quiet. She was not capable of managing a household in the way I understood managing. She managed it the way a spring flood manages a riverbank, by rearranging everything you thought was fixed. I loved her for it, and I spent 11 years trying to keep up, and then she was gone, and I was left standing in a kitchen that smelled like her bread, and I didn't know where she kept the flour. 2 days after the funeral, I opened every cabinet in that kitchen, one after another, looking for flour. Found it in the 3rd cabinet from the left top shelf behind the salt. I stood there with the tin in my hand for a long time. Couldn't tell you why I was looking for flour. I didn't even need flour. I just didn't know what else to do with my hands. I'm not telling you that to get your sympathy. I'm telling you because it matters for what came after. Because when I sat down and wrote to that agency in Kansas City, a thing I did not do lightly, a thing I thought about for 3 months, a thing I drafted 7 times, what I wanted was simple. Someone steady, someone who wouldn't rearrange me, someone I could learn to be fond of without the whole business costing me anything I couldn't afford to lose. 3 months of thinking, 7 drafts, and what I settled on was quiet disposition, capable of managing a household, accustomed to frontier conditions, not afraid of work. I sent money for the listing fee. I waited. 6 weeks later, a letter came back with 3 candidates, and I read all 3 letters, and Cecilia Voss was the one who said she was of quiet disposition and capable of managing a household. The other 2 women sounded like they had opinions about things. I thought that meant Cecilia didn't. That was the contract I thought I was making. Her name was Cecilia Voss. She arrived on a Wednesday. I know because I'd cleared my whole day, and Emmett, who works my northeast pasture, asked me why I was wearing my good shirt on a Wednesday, and I told him I was expecting someone, and he said, company. And I said, a wife, and he didn't say another word. Just put his hat back on and went back to the fence line, which was the right response. Emmett has always had the good sense to know when to stop talking. I've worked with him for 11 years, and that quality has never failed him yet. The stage came in just after 2 in the afternoon. There were 4 passengers, and 3 of them climbed down in the ordinary way that people climb down from stages, carefully, stiffly, looking around for their bag. The 4th did not climb down. She more or less arrived. One moment the door was opening, and the next she was standing in the dust with a large trunk, a smaller bag, what appeared to be a rolled-up rug under one arm, and a bird cage. The bird was alive. It was red. It was making a sound I could not immediately identify as a bird's sound. I walked over, she looked at me, I looked at her. Cecilia Voss was not what the letter described. She was not small. She was not soft around the edges the way some women are when they're trying to look gentle. She had brown hair that she'd put up, but some of it had come down from the ride, and she didn't seem to care. She had a wide jaw and eyes the color of creek water in August, which is to say greenish-brown and lit from somewhere behind them. She was maybe 32, 33. She was looking at me the way you look at a horse you're deciding whether to trust. I said, Miss Voss. She said, that bird does not belong to me. It escaped its cage 2 stops back and got into mine, and I have been holding it since Ellsworth. Where do you want me to put it? I said I didn't know, and she said that was fine. She'd figure it out. And she handed me the bird cage, which was empty, and picked up her own bag. I stood there holding someone else's empty bird cage, while Cecilia Voss looked at my wagon, and then at the street, and then back at me. Is the ranch far? She asked. 6 miles, I said. Good, she said. I'd like to see it before dark. She had already lifted her own bag into the wagon bed before I thought to do it for her. I loaded the trunk. She climbed up onto the seat before I could offer a hand, not rudely, just efficiently, the way you climb up when you've been climbing up onto wagon seats your whole life and haven't gotten into the habit of waiting. I got up the other side and we went. I want you to understand that I am not a man who is easily thrown. I have had a horse roll on me and break 2 ribs, and I walked back to the barn. I have sat across a table from men who wanted to take my land, and I did not blink. I once shot a rattlesnake off the porch railing from 40 feet at dusk without thinking about it. I am not a man who is easily thrown. She threw me inside of 4 minutes. We were 3 miles out before either of us said anything substantial. She was looking at the land, which is what people do when they first come out here. You can't help it. The country demands attention. The plains open up wide past the tree line and the sky comes down to meet them, and there's this particular quality of light in late afternoon that makes everything look like it's made of amber and shadow in equal parts. I've lived here 16 years and it still does something to me. Still makes me feel like I'm looking at something that doesn't need anything from me, which is its own kind of comfort. She said, "Your grass is short for this time of year." I said, "We had a dry spring." She said, "What's your well situation?" And I told her. I told her about the west well that went shallow in July, and the spring up by the north fence that I'd been thinking about running a line from for the better part of 2 years now, but hadn't gotten around to. The way you don't get around to things when you're working alone, and there are always more immediate problems. She asked about the soil condition in the lower quarter. She asked whether I'd considered rotating the pastures, because from what she could see the land in the middle section looked tired in a particular way that comes from too many years of the same cattle on the same ground. She asked, with no particular judgment in her voice, whether I'd been running the same number of cattle on the same ground for more than 3 years, because if so that would explain the grass. I had been running cattle for 22 years. She'd been on my wagon for 20 minutes. I looked at her sideways. She was still looking at the land. Her hands were in her lap. She had practical hands, wide across the palm, the knuckles a little rough. The bird, she'd tucked it inside her coat somehow, just its red head visible at the collar, was quiet. The bird had better sense than I did about when to stay still and watch. "Where did you grow up?" I asked. "Nebraska," she said. "My father ran cattle, then sheep. Then he decided he'd rather be a fool about it than sensible, so he sold everything and went to Denver to invest in something or other." She said it without heat, just as a fact. "I stayed and married Voss. Voss died. Here I am." I said, "I'm sorry about Voss." She said, "He was a decent man, not a great one, but decent." And then she looked at me directly for the first time since we'd left town, and she said, "What about you? What are you?" I didn't have an answer for that, not a quick one. I said something, I don't remember what, something about the land, the cattle, 17 years building the place, and she nodded like that was about what she'd expected and went back to looking at the plains. I could see the fence line of my north pasture in the distance now. The light had gone golden. She said half to herself, "That spring line. It'd need to go about a quarter mile to be useful, depends on the grade." I said, "There's a natural slope." She said, "Then why haven't you run it?" I said I hadn't had the time or the hands for it. She nodded again, didn't say anything else, but I had the feeling she was filing it under things that would get done now. The house, she looked at the way she'd looked at the land, methodical, taking inventory. She didn't comment much. She went through the kitchen, opened the root cellar, looked at the barn from the back door. She asked where the equipment shed was. She asked about the smokehouse. She asked whether there was someone who came in to help with washing or whether that was managed in-house, and I said in-house, just me, and she absorbed that too. She asked to see her room. I showed her. It was the room that used to be storage, which I'd spent the better part of 2 days cleaning out and setting up: a good bed, a dresser, a braided rug that had been in the storage room for years but cleaned up well, curtains I'd hung myself which were not straight and I knew it. She stood in the doorway and looked. She said, "This is fine, thank you." She didn't say anything about the curtains. I went back to the kitchen and started coffee. A few minutes later she came in with her bag and set it down and stood at the window looking out. The bird was on her shoulder by then. It had apparently decided the coat was a temporary arrangement. I said, "Does the bird have a name?" She said, "Not from me. I've been calling it Red. It seems to understand that well enough." She looked at it. "It's not mine." I said, "It seems to think it is." She said, "Yes, it does." She looked out the window again. "There's about 2 hours of light left. Would you show me the full property before dark?" We walked it, all of it. Every fence line, every building, the wells, the creek, the spring. She asked questions the whole time, not idle questions. The kind that go nowhere but exact ones. The kind that mean she's already working on something in her head and just needs the data. By the time we got back to the house, the light was gone and my boots were dusty and I was somewhere between worn out and unsettled in a way I couldn't name. Supper was eggs and salt pork, which I usually put together for myself without thinking. She cooked it and I let her. She didn't ask where anything was. She'd looked in the morning. She made coffee after, and we drank it at the table, and she told me about the Nebraska cattle operation, more detail than she'd given on the wagon. What her father had done right and what he'd done wrong, and what the land had needed that he'd never given it. She talked about it the way a man talks about land he knows well and has opinions about. She talked about Voss more briefly. He had not been interested in cattle, which had been their main disagreement. He'd been a town man who'd ended up on a farm, and he'd never reconciled those two things. I said, "How long were you married?" She said, 4 years. He had a bad heart, nobody knew until he did. I said I was sorry again, and she said again that he'd been decent and left it at that. She was looking at the wall behind me, and I understood she'd said what she was going to say about Voss and wasn't going to say more. I told her about Martha. I told her more than I usually do, about the 11 years and about what Martha had been like, not the loss of it but the thing itself. She listened. She didn't offer condolences. She just said when I was done, "She sounds like she had good judgment about land," because I'd mentioned Martha had pushed for the creekside pasture that turned out to be the best ground on the property. I said she did. She said, "So do you. You're just slower about acting on it." I looked at her. She picked up her cup and drank. She didn't seem to think she'd said anything remarkable. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe it was just a fact. The first week was like that. She moved through the house the way you'd move through a room you're measuring. She didn't redecorate, she didn't move things, but she noticed everything. I'd come in for supper and find she'd reorganized the root cellar in a way that made immediate sense. Flour and staples near the door. Canned things together, preserves in back. And I'd wonder why I hadn't thought of it, except that I had thought of it years ago, and just never done it because it would have meant a full morning, and there were always more immediate problems. She cooked well, not fancy, solid, meat and root vegetables and bread that rose right, the kind of cooking where you sit back afterward and realize you're full without remembering eating. She went through the pantry and made a list and handed it to me without comment. I looked at the list. It was sensible. I took it to town at the end of the week. She slept in the room I'd set up for her. I told her that first evening that the arrangement was however she wanted it to be, that I wasn't expecting anything and she shouldn't feel obligated to anything, and we could talk about the rest of it when and if she wanted to. She had looked at me for a moment and then said, "All right," in a way that meant she'd understood and was filing it away and would think about it on her own time. Which was fine. That was a reasonable thing. I won't pretend I wasn't watching her that first week. A man who brings a woman into his house and doesn't watch her is a fool. But I was watching the way you watch a piece of country you're trying to understand, not suspiciously, just trying to find where the water runs, where the weather comes from, what moves it. What moved her was work. Not because she had to work, though she did, and did it without complaint, but because she liked it. I'd catch her in the middle of some task that nobody had asked her to do, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and is doing it because it's the right thing to do. She fixed a hinge on the kitchen cabinet door that had been loose for 2 years. She washed the windows, inside and out. She went through the medicine shelf and threw out things that were too old to be useful and wrote down what needed replacing in the same neat hand. She wrote the pantry list. On the 4th night, she knocked on the door to the main room where I was going over the ledgers, and she said, "I found something in the barn." I said, "What?" She said, "Calves, new ones. 3, the mother's in trouble." I was on my feet before she finished the sentence. We were in the barn until close to 3 in the morning. The cow had gotten herself turned around with the 3rd calf, and it was a near thing. Cecilia held the lantern, then held the cow's head, then handed me things without me asking because she could see what I needed. There was no conversation. Just the work and the lamplight and the sound of the barn, the restless shifting of the horses in their stalls, the wind outside picking up, the low, distressed sounds of the cow. And at some point I became aware that my shirt was soaked through, and my knees hurt from the ground, and the 3rd calf was breathing, and the cow was still standing, and I sat back against the stall wall and looked up at the barn ceiling where the lamplight didn't quite reach. Cecilia set the lantern on a post. She sat on the milking stool across from me. She had blood on her sleeve from where she'd grabbed the calf and hay all through her hair where she'd braced against the stall, and there was a long smear of mud across her forearm that she didn't seem to notice or care about. We both looked at the 3 calves, which were getting themselves sorted out with the particular wobbly urgency of new things that don't know yet that the world is large and cold. After a while she said, "You're good at that." I said, you are too. She said, I should be. I've been doing it since I was 11. She paused. My father sent me out with the hands on the first cold night of the year, every year. He said you learn from the ones that go wrong. She looked at the calf. This one almost went wrong. I said, but it didn't. She said, no, it didn't. She got up and got 2 cups from somewhere. I hadn't even noticed she'd brought anything, and poured coffee from a pot I also hadn't noticed her bringing, and she handed me one and sat back down on the stool. I held it. It was warm, and I was cold in the way you get cold after a long, hard thing when the work stops, and you realize your body has been spending itself without telling you. The coffee tasted like coffee. Strong, the way I made it. She'd made it the way I made it. She said, without looking at me, you've been running this whole place alone. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a thing she was saying out loud, like she was putting it somewhere she could look at it. I said, more or less, Emmett helps with the pasture work. She said, but the rest of it. I didn't answer. The rest of it was the rest of it. You do what needs doing and you don't catalog it. After a moment she said, my husband Voss, he didn't like this kind of work. The nighttime kind, the emergency kind. He said it wasn't organized. It bothered him that you couldn't plan for it. She set her cup down on her knee, both hands around it. It used to bother me that it bothered him, because this is just what land does. It doesn't wait for a convenient time. I said, no, it doesn't. She looked across at me. In the lamplight she looked different than she did in daylight, steadier somehow, like the dark settled something in her face that the day kept moving. She said, I don't mind it. The nighttime work, just so you know. I said, I can see that. We drank the coffee. The calves found their legs in the clumsy way calves do, all knees and determination. One of them made it as far as its mother, and we watched that happen without saying anything about it. After a while, I got up and checked everything again, and it was all right as it was going to be tonight, and I blew out the second lamp. She carried the lantern back to the house. I came behind with the cups. The yard was cold and the sky was fully dark, and you could see about 10,000 stars, which you always can out here when the weather's clear. She stopped at the porch step and looked up. She said, I'd forgotten what this looks like. I said, what sky? She said, this much of it. She stood there a moment. Nebraska was good for it, but I was in town the last few years after Voss. You forget. I said, you get used to it, and then you stop seeing it. She said, yes. She looked a moment longer, then she went inside. I thanked her for the barn work when we got in. She said I didn't need to thank her, that she lived here now. The same thing she'd said on the wagon, the same flat, certain way she said it. But I thought, standing there, that she'd said it on purpose both times, that it was something she'd decided. I didn't know what to do with that yet, but I noticed it. I should tell you about the fire. It was 3 weeks in, a Sunday. I was at the far end of the north field checking the fence I'd been meaning to fix since April, 3 posts gone soft at the base, 2 sections of wire loosened by something that had pushed through, probably deer, maybe worse, and I was working my way along it when I saw the smoke from there. This thick white column going straight up from the direction of the house, and I felt my stomach turn to rock, and I ran for the horse. I could smell it before I could see it, that particular smell of old dry wood going fast, not the good smell of a hearth fire, but the wrong smell of something burning that isn't supposed to. Then I came over the low rise and I could see it. The equipment shed. Not the house, thank God, not the barn, the equipment shed. And it was burning in the fast, confident way dry wood burns when it's had years to get ready for it. I came off the horse at a run, and Cecilia was already there with a bucket line going from the trough to the shed. Just her and Emmett's youngest boy, who'd been around that day doing some fence repair near the house, but she had it organized the way you'd organize something if you'd thought about it for years. She was soaked from the shoulders down from a bucket that had sloshed, and she was directing the boy, and she saw me coming in at the gallop, and she pointed left, which was where the gap in the line was, and I filled it without stopping to ask any questions. We got ahead of it before it took the roof. The walls were scorched, and one corner of the roof was going to need work, but the structure held. When the smoke came down to wisps and the last hot spots were drowned, I walked around the building once checking for anything still live, and then I stood in the yard and breathed. Cecilia was standing a few feet away. She had a hand on her hip, and she was looking at the scorched wall with the expression of a woman taking stock. The boy, Emmett's son, his name is Carl, he's about 15, was sitting on the edge of the trough looking like he'd survived something, because he had. I asked her what happened. She told me. She'd been heating pitch for the fence posts in the lower quarter, a thing I hadn't asked her to do but that she'd figured needed doing before winter set in and the wood froze, and the pot had gone over on the workbench and caught the old rags I'd left piled in the corner of the shed for 15 years. Dry as paper. They went all at once. She'd gotten out fast and gotten water faster. She told me all of this in a level voice, not hurrying through it, not justifying herself. She waited when she was done. I said, "Are you hurt?" She showed me her right hand. The heel of it was red, a burn from grabbing something she shouldn't have grabbed to try to stop it early. She tried to stop it early, before it got to the wall, and she'd burned her hand doing it and failed, and then she'd gotten sensible and gotten out and gotten the bucket line going. I said, "Come inside." I'd learned by then where she kept things. 3 weeks and I knew the medicine shelf the way I knew it when it was my shelf, only better organized. I sat her down at the kitchen table and I cleaned the burn. It was a second-degree burn, not trivial, and put the salve on it and wrapped it with a good bandage cloth. And she sat still for all of it with her hand flat on the table, watching me work. When I was done, she looked at her hand in the bandage for a moment. She said, "I should have been more careful with the pitch." I said, "I should have thrown out those rags 15 years ago." There was a pause. Carl was outside somewhere, probably at the trough, because we could hear the scrape of the bucket handle. She said, "Half and half then." I said, "Half and half." She looked at the table. Then she said, in that way she had of talking about the next thing while the last thing was still in the room, "The fence posts in the lower quarter, that's what I was pitching them for. They're going to go before winter if they don't get treated." I said I knew. I said I just hadn't gotten to it. She nodded. She said, "I'll do the east run if you do the south." She looked at her bandaged hand. "In a few days." I said, "All right." That was how it worked. Not all at once and not with any announcement. Just piece by piece, week by week, job by job. A decision made and a job shared and the land a little better at the end of the day than it had been at the start. She didn't ask permission and she didn't take credit. She just moved through the work the way she moved through the house, noticing what needed doing and doing it. I'll tell you what I didn't know how to do with that at first. I'd been managing alone for 3 years since Martha died. 3 years of being the only person who knew where things stood, the only person who cared about the fence in the lower quarter, the only person who was going to do anything about the west well or the rotated pasture or the spring line. You get a particular way of holding yourself when you've been managing alone that long. You get compact. You stop expecting help. You stop half reaching for it because it's not there and it's better not to reach for things that aren't there. And then Cecilia Voss showed up with a birdcage and a burned hand and a list of things she was going to fix, and I didn't know, for a while, how to let her. About 6 weeks in, at supper, she put down her fork and looked at me across the table and said, "I need to talk to you about the spring line." I said I was listening. She had it all worked out. The grade, the trench length, the pipe she'd need, the cost of it. She'd drawn it out on a piece of paper that she produced from somewhere on her person, a neat diagram with measurements. She knew what she was talking about. She'd clearly been thinking about it since the day we drove out from town. I looked at the diagram. I said, "That grade drops off at the north end. You'd need a different run." She said, "I know, I accounted for it. Here," she pointed. She had accounted for it. I said, "What would you run the pipe through? The ground's rocky up there." She said, "You'd trench it. It would take 3-4 days with 2 men. I said, "Where do you get the second man?" She said, "From wherever you usually get men when you need them." I said I usually didn't hire extra hands because it was expensive, and I didn't like having strangers on the property. She said, "Emmett's son is 15 and competent and probably wants work." I sat back and looked at the diagram again. It was right. It would fix the water problem that had been half crippling the west pasture every July for the past 6 years. It would cost something. It would be done by late fall if we started in the next 2 weeks. I said, "All right." She picked up her fork and went back to supper. I watched her for a moment. She was eating and not making anything of it. She'd proposed something, I'd agreed, and now supper was happening. That was the whole of it for her. I said, "You'd already decided to do it." She said, "I was going to do it either way. It's better if you know. I said, what if I'd said no? She considered this. She said, I'd have waited a while and brought it up again differently. I said, how differently? She said, I don't know yet. I would have figured it out. She said it like this was all very reasonable, which I supposed it was. I had the strange feeling that I was watching someone navigate me the way you navigate a piece of country, not against it, just working with the contour of it, finding the natural route. I said, you're not particularly quiet. She looked up, something moved in her face. Then she said, no, I'm not. I told the agency I was because I thought that's what men asked for. She went back to her plate. I'm practical and I work hard. I thought those were more valuable than quiet, but I wasn't sure you'd see it that way. I looked at her. She said, I was wrong about what you'd see. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, we'll start the trench the week after next. She nodded, just nodded, and finished her supper. There was an evening, maybe 2 months in. October, the air starting to have that edge in it. I'd had a bad day, not a dramatic bad day, just the ordinary kind of bad where everything takes longer than it should and 2 things break, and one of them can't be fixed before dark and the cattle are restless for no reason you can identify, and by the time the light goes you're tired in a way that's more than your body. I came in and she had supper on and I sat down and I just didn't say much. I ate. She asked one question about the south fence, and I answered it, and then we were quiet for a while. After supper, she was clearing the table, and I was sitting there with my coffee, and she stopped and looked at me. Not long, just a beat. She said, bad day. It wasn't a question. I said, nothing serious, just long. She said, She went back to clearing. Then she said, without looking over, the spring line's in good shape, water's running clear. She knew I'd been sitting with whether the line had seated right at the north join. We'd done the trench the previous month, and it had been hard work, and I'd been uncertain about one section. She'd checked it that afternoon, apparently, and she was telling me it was fine in the way you tell someone something you know they've been sitting with. I said, you checked it. She said, I was out that way. I said, thank you. She said, don't thank me, it's our water. Our water, 2 months in, and she said it like it had always been that way. I held that for a long time after she'd gone to wash up. Our water, our fence, our calves, not hers and not mine but ours, and she'd moved into that arrangement so naturally that I almost hadn't noticed it happening. Almost. There's a thing that happens when a woman has been on a property long enough. The place starts to carry her in it. Not in any sentimental way, I don't mean that. I mean practically. You start to see her decisions everywhere you look. The reorganized root cellar, the new hinge on the cabinet, the spring line running where there wasn't one. After 2 months, I couldn't walk through my own land without seeing evidence of her, which was strange, and then wasn't. The cattle knew her before I'd fully figured out what to make of her. Animals are like that. They don't wait for you to decide. The cows let her in the pasture without making anything of it, which they don't do with strangers, and the 2 horses that I'd always considered difficult came to her fence rail like dogs, which had never happened with anyone but me. I watched her with them one evening from the barn. She wasn't doing anything particular, just standing there with one hand on the rail looking at the north pasture, and the horses were standing next to her. She wasn't paying attention to them. They were paying attention to her. Emmett noticed. He said something one afternoon in October, out near the fence line, some remark about the changes he was seeing in the place. He said, she's got a head for it. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation, the way Emmett made most observations, like he was noting what the weather was doing and filing it away. I said she did. He said he'd seen a few women come out to the frontier, and most of them spent the first year fighting the land and the second year leaving it. He said the ones who stayed were the ones who stopped fighting it and started working with it. I said that sounded right. He said, she's one of those. Then he went back to the fence. I thought about that on the ride back, one of those. Like she was a category of person, rare enough that Emmett had a framework for it, common enough that there was a framework to have. I didn't know what to do with it except to think that he was probably right. There were arguments. I should tell you that too. Not loud ones, neither of us is built for loud, but the kind that happen when 2 people who know what they're doing have different ideas about what should be done. The first real one was about the South herd. I'd been planning to sell off 6 head before winter because I was concerned about feed supply, and she disagreed. She said I was overcounting the risk and undercounting the pasture capacity, and she had numbers to back it, from the rotation she'd set up and from what she'd observed in the east section. I said I'd been making this call for 16 years. She said that didn't mean I'd always made it right. We didn't speak much the rest of that evening. I sold 4 head instead of 6. A compromise, not a capitulation, which I told myself was the right distinction. When we got through winter with the feed to spare, she didn't say I told you so. She just noted on her way past me one morning that the east section had come through better than she'd expected, and went on. Which was, I understood, the same as I told you so, but delivered in a way I couldn't take exception to. The second argument was about money, about what I was charging for the late-season calves, and whether I was leaving something on the table by not holding them another 30 days. She was right about this too, as it turned out, and I sold them late and got the better price, and I said so at supper that night directly. You were right about the calves. And she looked at me across the table with those creekwater eyes and said, yes, and went back to eating. Not dismissive, just factual. I liked that about her. She didn't need me to make a thing of it. She just needed it to be said. We married on a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks after she arrived, though I realize I'm telling this out of order. Memory does that. The pieces don't come in sequence, they come in weight. The heavy things first, then the things that explain the heavy things, and the order of it is always wrong by the calendar. We'd never had a formal conversation about when or whether. I'd told her on the first night that there was no obligation, that the arrangement was however she wanted it, and she'd said, all right, in that filing-it-away voice, and after that it just hadn't come up. We'd been too busy for a while, and then it felt like a thing that didn't need to come up, which is its own kind of answer. One morning over coffee, a week or so before it happened, she said, we should probably make this legal. Just like that over coffee, looking at the window. I said yes. She said Tuesday. I said Tuesday. We didn't discuss it further. She wrote a letter to the county seat. I told Emmett, and he told his wife Nora, who showed up the morning of with a pie and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to happen, and is gratified that it has. The preacher was a thin man named Gillum who rode out from town and seemed pleasantly surprised that the ceremony was proceeding, as if he'd gotten some preliminary report that suggested it might not. He conducted it on the front porch because the day was good enough for it, and Cecilia had swept the porch that morning without saying why, which I understood later. She wore a blue dress I hadn't seen before, brought from her trunk, and she'd done something with her hair that had it up properly and pinned with 2 pins that caught the light. She was not a woman who fussed with her appearance in the ordinary way, but she'd paid attention this day, and she looked, I'll say handsome because that's the word. That's the real word for what she looked. Not soft, not pretty in the usual way, something more durable than that. The bird sat on the porch, railing through the whole ceremony, and didn't make a sound. I noticed this particularly because the bird usually had opinions about everything. Emmett clapped me on the shoulder afterward and said she was something else, and I said I knew, and he said he meant it as high praise, and I said I knew that too. We had dinner at the house. Nora had brought the pie. Cecilia had made the rest over the 2 previous days, quietly and without advertising what she was doing, the same way she did most things. It was a good meal, the kind you eat slowly without meaning to, because the food is right and the evening is good and there's no particular hurry. When the Emmets went home, and it was just us and the quiet of the house and read on the curtain rod, she cleared the table and I helped, and we moved around each other in the kitchen in the way we'd learned to move, without getting in each other's way, without announcing anything, just knowing where the other one was. She was folding a dish towel when she said, "There's something I should tell you." I said, "All right." She said, "When I wrote to the agency, I told them I was calm and even-tempered." She set the towel on the counter and turned to face me. "I'm not. I'm practical and reliable and I work hard, but I'm not calm. I have opinions about things and I act on them before I always should, and I pushed Voss into 2 decisions he wasn't ready for, and I have burned down a piece of your property." She held my gaze steady. "I wanted you to know that before we're any further into this." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Your first husband sounds like a man who didn't know what he had." She went still. I said, "I'm not that man." She said slowly, "No. I don't think you are." She crossed the kitchen and she put both hands on my chest, just flat there, feeling. I put one hand over hers. She was looking up at me and her eyes in the lamplight were that August Creek color, greenish-brown and lit from somewhere behind them, and she was very close. I could feel her breathing. The kitchen smelled like supper and wood smoke, and something that was just hers, some combination of things I couldn't name separately but recognized. She said, "I think we're going to do fine." I said, "I think so too." We stood like that for a while. I could feel her hands through my shirt, warm and solid and still. The burn on her right hand had healed, but I could still feel the edge of the ridge of it, just slightly, the way a scar stays even after it's finished being a scar. I put my thumb against it, and she let me. After a while she said, "I never set out to burn down your shed." And I laughed. Not a polite one, a real one from somewhere low that hadn't been used in a good while, the kind that surprised me coming out. She smiled. She had a wide smile, Cecilia. The kind that doesn't apologize for itself, doesn't soften at the edges, just comes all the way out and stays there. I'd been watching it appear and disappear for 2 months, and every time it still surprised me, which I don't quite understand except that some faces have expressions they hold in reserve and only bring out when they mean it. Winter came hard that year. By November, the temperature had dropped enough to kill the last of the garden, and by December, we were getting storms off the north that lasted 2 and 3 days. We lost 2 calves to the cold in January, which hurts in a way that doesn't get easier no matter how many years you've been doing it. You do everything right, and the cold wins anyway. But we saved 4 more in the same week, working the barn through the night the same way we'd worked it in September, and that balanced it some. The bird survived the winter on a perch near the stove. It had negotiated that position sometime in November and seemed to consider it a reasonable arrangement. By February, it had started doing a particular whistle when Cecilia came into the kitchen in the morning, which she ignored in the way you ignore something you've privately decided to be fond of. In February, there was a week of storms that kept us inside. We played cards. She won more than I did and was gracious about it in a way that meant she knew she was being gracious, which is not the same as being humble but is more interesting. We read. She'd brought books from her trunk, history, 1 novel, what looked like an agricultural journal she'd kept herself, which I asked about and she showed me. Notes on soil condition and rotation and what had worked and what hadn't, going back 12 years. 12 years. She'd been keeping records since before Voss. We talked, not careful talk, not the kind you do when you're still finding the edges. The real kind, where you say things you don't expect to say because the weather outside is doing something loud, and the inside is warm and time slows down. She told me about Nebraska, about growing up in it, about her father in the years before he went to Denver, about her mother, who had died when Cecilia was 14, and who, from what she said, had been the sensible one of the two and had known it, and managed her father gently around it. The way some women manage men around the fact of their own foolishness without making them feel foolish. Cecilia said she'd tried to do the same thing with Voss, and it hadn't worked because Voss didn't want to be managed, even gently. He wanted to be agreed with, which was a different thing entirely. About the years with Voss, not painfully, not with grief, but honestly. He had been a good man in the ways he could manage and a limited one in the ways he couldn't, and she'd made the best of it, and when he died she'd grieved him properly, and then she'd looked at what was left and figured out what to do next. That was how she said it. Looked at what was left, figured out what to do. Like it was the most natural thing in the world, which for her I think it was. I asked her on one of those nights whether she'd thought about staying in Nebraska. Whether the agency had been her first idea, or whether she'd considered other things. She said I could have stayed. There was a man in the county, a widower with a good farm, who made it plain he was interested. She said this without any coyness about it. He was decent, steady, he would have been comfortable. I said, "What stopped you?" She thought about this for a moment. She said, "He already had his life the way he wanted it. There wasn't anything for me to do there. It was already done." She looked at the fire. I wanted something that still needed doing. I sat with that for a while. I told her things I don't usually tell. About the years before Martha, I'd come out here young and without much, and built the place from 40 acres and a bad-tempered mule. And there had been a period in my 20s where I wasn't sure it was going to hold together, where I was 2 bad seasons away from losing everything, and I knew it, and kept going anyway because stopping didn't seem like a real option. About what 11 years of that kind of marriage does to you, how it shapes you in ways you don't notice until you're alone and you can feel the shape of the space where it was. About the 3 years after, which I'd spent becoming very efficient about everything and not talking to anyone beyond what the work required and telling myself that was fine, that I was managing. She listened to the 3 years part for a moment, and then she said, "You weren't managing, you were waiting." I said, "For what?" She looked at me, she said, "I don't know, but that's what it sounds like." I thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. Still think about it sometimes. Whether she was right. Whether there's any difference between the two things, managing and waiting, when you can't name what you're waiting for. On the fourth night of the storms, late, the fire burning low and Red asleep on his perch, she said, "You know what I thought when I first saw you?" I said, "What?" She said, "I thought, this is a man who has been managing alone for a long time. You could see it in how you stood. Like you were used to carrying the weight to one side so the other side was free for emergencies." She looked at the fire for a moment. "My father had the same posture after my mother died, before he turned foolish about it." I said, "Is it gone now, that posture?" She looked at me long enough that I felt it. She said, "Mostly. You still do it sometimes when you think no one's watching." I said, "Do I?" She said, "Yes." She held my eyes. "I'm watching." Spring came and the land came back with it the way land does, indifferent to what you've been through. The calves we'd saved were healthy and growing. The spring line ran clear. The fence in the lower quarter held. The west pasture was already looking better from the rotation Cecilia had started in October. The grass coming in thicker, greener, the land breathing easier. There was a morning in April, a Thursday, nothing particular about it. I'd been up since before first light because we had a sick steer and I'd spent 4 hours in the barn and come in at around 7 with my hands rough from the cold water and my back telling me about the years. She had coffee on. She handed me a cup and looked at my hands and said, "Sit down." And she got the salve from the shelf without asking and sat across from me at the kitchen table and put my hands flat on the table and rubbed the salve in. Just like that. Just as a practical thing because my hands were rough and the salve was there, and she had 2 minutes. She was looking at my hands while she did it, not at my face. She had that slight furrow between her eyes she got when she was paying attention to something. The kitchen was warm and there was light coming in the east window, and Red was on his perch being quiet, and the steer was going to be all right. I'd decided by then. I watched the top of her head. The brown hair, some gray in it now that I hadn't noticed getting there. The particular way she held herself when she was concentrating, shoulders easy, leaned in slightly, doing the thing with her full attention. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the fire in the stove and Red shifting on his perch, and somewhere outside, one of the horses moving in the yard. The whole property going about its morning. Our property. I said, "Cecilia." She said, not looking up. I said, "I know what I am now." She stopped, looked up at me. I said, "You asked me on the wagon. First day, I didn't have an answer." She was very still, watching me. I said, "I'm someone who needed the right person to come along and see what was there, and tell him the truth about it." I held her gaze. "You did that. You've been doing it since the first day. The grass, the wells, the fence, the calves, the spring line, the south herd, and me." I stopped. "I'm glad it was you who came." She looked at me for a long moment. Long enough that I could see something move through her face that she didn't bother to hide and didn't reach up to smooth away. Then she looked back down at my hands and went back to the salve, but her hands were a little less efficient than they'd been before, less brisk, and when she finished, she didn't let go right away. She said to the table, "I'm glad it was you too." She said it quietly, just those 6 words, and they landed the way plain words land when there's nothing extra in them and nothing left out. She meant the real one, the one with the rags in the shed, and the weight carried wrong and 7 drafts of a letter asking for the wrong thing. She meant exactly that man and not a better version of him. We sat there with my hands in hers for longer than the task required. Neither of us moved. Outside, the horse was still moving around in the yard, and Red was still being quiet on his perch, and the fire in the stove was doing what fires do. And it was just an April morning on a ranch that needed work, same as every morning, except that it wasn't. After a while, she gave my hands back to me and got up and went to start on whatever was next. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. I thought I wanted quiet. I thought I was being practical about what was left of my life and my land and what I could and couldn't manage anymore. 3 months of thinking and 7 drafts, and what I'd asked for was someone who wouldn't cost me anything. What I wanted was to be seen, not managed, not tolerated, not settled for seen. By someone who was worth being seen by. Cecilia Voss saw me inside of one wagon ride. She saw the land wrong and the wells wrong and the fence wrong and the grass wrong, and she saw me, a man who'd been managing alone too long, carrying the weight to one side, half reaching for help and pulling back before he got there. She didn't make a thing of it. She just started showing up. She pitched fence posts I hadn't asked her to pitch. She checked the spring line because she knew I'd been sitting with whether it had seated right. She organized the root cellar in a way that made immediate sense and said nothing about it. She kept records of soil conditions for 12 years and brought them out of her trunk during a blizzard because she trusted me with them. She burned down a piece of my property trying to take care of something that needed taking care of, and when I asked if she was hurt, she showed me her hand. And she chose me. That's what I mean by all of it. She had Nebraska behind her and a decent dead husband and an agency placement, and exactly as much obligation as a contract can hold. She could have been useful and polite and kept her distance and waited to see what I was. She didn't. She put her hands on my chest on our wedding night and said we're going to do fine and meant it with everything she was. She chose the real one, the one who hadn't known what he was when she asked, the one who left rags in a shed for 15 years. The one who was bad at asking for help and worse at knowing he needed it, and had been carrying the weight to one side until he forgot what it felt like to carry it straight. She looked at all of that on a 6-mile wagon ride, and she showed up in the barn at midnight and organized the bucket line and checked the spring line and set our water and meant it. I don't have fancy words for what that is. I just know what it did to me. Filled something in, put something back in its right place that had been sitting wrong for a long time. It's been 9 years. The shed is rebuilt, better than the original stone foundation this time, which was Cecilia's suggestion and which means it will outlast both of us. The wells are sorted, the spring line runs, the pastures rotate. We added 10 acres to the south side 4 years ago, and she negotiated the price with the neighboring widow, which went better than it would have gone if I'd done it. We have more cattle than we did and they're in better condition, and we lose fewer of them to the cold now because of changes Cecilia figured out the second winter, and I implemented the third. We lost Red last spring. He'd been on his perch by the stove for 9 years and one morning he wasn't, and we buried him by the kitchen garden in the ground that was just getting soft enough to work. Cecilia took it harder than she expected to, which I could see even though she didn't say much about it. I said he'd been a good bird. She said yes, he had. That was the extent of it. But she looked at the empty perch for a while before she moved it. Emmett is older now. His son Carl works the northeast pasture most days. Time does what time does to men who work outside. The land stays mostly the same. The light in late afternoon still comes down over the plains in that particular way that makes everything look like amber and shadow in equal parts. And I still feel something when I see it, something about the size of the country and the smallness of any one life inside it, and the improbability of having built anything that holds. More than I did before. I notice it more now, which I think is her doing, though she'd say that's not a reasonable thing to credit to one person. I come in at dusk most evenings and she's at the table. Reading or writing, she keeps up correspondence with several women from the agency, which I've always found quietly amusing, and she maintains her records still, the Agricultural Journal, now spanning 20 years. The lamp is lit. The stove is going. She looks up when she hears the door, takes quick stock, the same look she gave me off the stage that first day, checking whether to trust, and goes back to what she's doing. I sit down, pour the coffee she's left on the stove for me, sit across from her and drink it and watch her face in the lamplight, the brown hair that's mostly gray now, the slight furrow she still gets when she's paying attention to something. Some nights she looks up and catches me watching and doesn't say anything. Just looks for a moment and goes back to the page. That's enough. I think about the man who wrote a letter asking for quiet, who thought he was being practical, who read the words quiet disposition and thought, good, that's what I need, and selected the woman who promised it and got something else entirely. He didn't know what he was asking for. He thought he knew the shape of what was left of his life, and he was wrong from the first minute, and being wrong was the best thing that ever happened to him. She never set out to burn down my shed. She just showed up and set everything on fire anyway. I'm glad she did. I'd have burned the whole place down myself if it meant she'd stay.